Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Adon Getachew, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at the University of Chicago, and have been involved with the More Than Diversity campaign since last summer. For those of you who don't know, the More Than Diversity campaign was organized by faculty affiliates of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture as a way of advancing conversations around diversity and equity on campus, by thinking through questions about the departmentalization of the study of race, rethinking public safety on campus, reconsidering the relationship between the university and the South Side through frameworks of repair and reparations. We'll be engaged in that conversation today on the theme of truth, reconciliation, and reparations, possibility and accountability in universities. I'm really grateful for the Center for the Study of Race and Politics and Culture for hosting us. I want to thank Professor C. Riley Snorton, the faculty director, Executive Director Tracy Matthews, and the staff, Marilyn Willis, Jacqueline Gaines, and Tiara Kilpatrick, who've put today together. And I want to thank all of you who are joining us on this Friday afternoon. So today we have in conversation Professor Anthony Bogues and Professor Marcia Chatelain. Just a few minutes before we started, we were both remembering that about 5 years ago, we were at a convening at Brown University to begin to think through exactly this question about reparations in the university, and it emerged in the context of ongoing student struggles on campuses ranging from Missouri to Yale, who were making various kinds of demands about racial equality. So it's I'm very grateful to have both of them with us today and for them to share with us their experiences and the particular projects they've been involved with. So I'll introduce both of them. They'll speak each for about 15 minutes about those experiences. I'll pose some questions, and we also invite audience members to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So first we'll hear from Anthony Bogues. Professor Bogues is the Asa Macer Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory, and the inaugural director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. He's also visiting professor and curator at the University of Johannesburg. The author and editor of 8 books in the fields of intellectual history, political theory, and art. He has curated exhibitions in the US, Caribbean, and South Africa. He's currently working on a book titled Black Critique, and editing with Bedur Algra, a volume on Sylvia Wynter's work, as well as writing 2 intellectual biographies, one on C.L.R. James and the other on Sylvia Wynter. He is the co-convener of 2 major exhibition projects, one titled Slavery, Colonialism, and the Making of the Modern World with the National African American Museum of History and Culture, and the other, an African Diaspora Contemporary Art Project platform on Black Lives Today titled Imagined New. He's a regular columnist for the South African newspaper Mail and Guardian, and his articles have also appeared in the Financial Times. Marcia Chatelain is professor of history at Georgetown University. She is the author of Southside Girls Growing Up in the Great Migration, and most recently of Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. Marcia is a specialist in African American life and culture. In 2015, she served on Georgetown University's working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation. So I'll turn it over first to Professor Bogues.
Thank you very much. And I want to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to say a few remarks around the theme of truth, reparations, and reconciliation. And I want to begin by just making it clear that when I say truth, that what I'm trying to gesture towards or speak about is really historical truth. That is truth that in which we have to deal with and grapple with the historical systems of injustice or systems that of historical wrong. So my notion of truth, therefore, is an absolute one. It's really related to this business of historical truth. I want to speak about these particular concepts of racial of reparation, particular reparations and historical truth, with a specific reference to the work at Brown University on what was called the Slavery and Justice Committee, and then the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. I will do so in 3 parts. Firstly, I want to say a few remarks about the conditions for the production of the landmark report of 2006, the Slavery and Justice Report, a report that has become a benchmark for many universities in them trying to think about how do they grapple with their historical past. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about what the report left out. And here I want to be self-critical. Self-critical because I was both a member of the committee as well as a member of the writing committee that did the report. I think it's important that we think about, one thinks about what is it that was left out and why, in fact, it was left out at that point in time. And then thirdly, I want to say a few words about reparations, or what I prefer to call reparative justice. And as I said, I use this word very deliberately because I think to think about the questions of repair, so-called repair, and think about questions of reparations is also, quite frankly, to think about forms of justice, whether they are distributive forms of justice, or whether they are, or whether there is, or whether it is what some of us would call forms of transformative justice. That is, forms of justice which actually transforms a historical wrong, make way for something else, and establishes, if possible, new grounds for relationships of common association. And so to think of thinking about this, one thinks that questions of historical injustice, of racial slavery, of colonialism and of apartheid are both historical injustices, of what some of us have called also historical wrongs. Historical catastrophes. That is, wrongs that have been done over the long jury, wrongs which are repeatable and which continue to repeat themselves, not in one historical episode, but actually over a very long period. These wrongs, I would want to argue, operate like sediment deposits, which then travel through time, shaping the structures and the everyday relationships of society. So with that kind of preamble, let me get to my first point, the conditions which produced the landmark Slavery and Justice Report. In the early 2000s, Charles Ogletree and a group of other scholars and lawyers began a process in which they were thinking about the litigation of corporations and universities who were beneficiaries of the Atlantic slave trade. Brown was on that list. It was not the top of the list, but it was on that particular list. So I want to establish that there was a set of articles externally, particularly in the New York Times and elsewhere, Wall Street Journal and so on, that identified Brown as a university in which which was a beneficiary of the Atlantic slave trade. Secondly, that there was a reparations debate that was beginning to happen again in the African American community. We will know that the debates about reparations ebb and flow, that ever since the end of the Civil War, that there are moments in which there's a lot of discussion, and then there's some moments when there's not a lot of discussion, or where there seems to be not a lot of discussion. But that there was a growing discussion in around questions of reparations, again, in the African American community. So those are the two external factors. One, the way in which Charles Ogletree and others were beginning to think about litigations around reparations, the reparations debate that I think was beginning to happen again in the African American community. But there were also some internal things that I think we would need to think about. One of them is specifically what happened at Brown. And that there was a fellow called David Horowitz, who was a former supporter of the Black Panther Party, and who had become very conservative. And within the framework of the reparations debate, had put in the Brown Daily Herald, which was a student newspaper at Brown, a full-page ad which began with something like this: no reparations for Black people are lazy. And that also, and continues to say that many whites had actually died for Black people in emancipation, and therefore there was no need. If you're going to give people some reparations, you should probably give some of the white folks who had died from the Union Army. This one-page ad in the Brown Daily Herald was a cause of great consternation. A group of Black and white students went to the Brown Daily Herald editorial and demanded that they do not publish this ad. The paper did. What the students then did was that they seized the paper. The paper is published at a certain time in the morning, obviously. They went to where the paper was offloaded and took all the papers that they could find and dumped them. And so that the papers did not appear in the usual. This is the newspaper that comes out every morning. So it's a regular, weekday paper for the students. The students were escorted by many people. There was a threatening of many students to be expelled. And there was, as usual in these instances, the argument was raised about free speech. No student was expelled, but many were really, I think, criticized by many folks, both faculty and some student leadership. Criticized some of the students who were involved in this. What was important, though, is that the entire incident really led to a big uproar on campus and an internal debate on the university campus about free speech. And that debate about free speech just kept on, was kept on going. And what is important, one of the interesting things I think is to think about is when one begins to think about anything that has to do with Black folks and trying to transform the university, immediately a whole group of people begin to talk about free speech. Right? And so this particular shibboleth of free speech again came out. And as I said, was, the entire university campus was engaged in this. The second internal factor was that Dr. Ruth Simmons had just been appointed president of the university as the first African-American female president of an Ivy League university. Part of our response to this, our engagement and argument around free speech and around the season of the papers and the dumping, was actually to give a remarkable lecture to the student body, making a distinction between speech and harm. And the second thing that she did was to establish the Slavery and Justice Committee. This particular committee, she asked to deliver a history of Brown's relationship to the transatlantic slave trade and to make a set of recommendations. I recently interviewed her because we're doing a revised version of the report, and we have authors writing essays, one of them including Marsha, who was on campus at the time. And in interviewing her, I asked her, why did she do this? Wouldn't this have caused her great trouble with the corporation and so on? And her view was very simple. She said that she came to Brown, there was all this discussion about reparations. She asked everybody, did Brown have any relationship to the slave trade? And people told her no. But she knew that, but instinctively she knew that was not right. And so she felt that the only way, in fact, she could deal with this thing, and to make Brown begin to understand its history and relationship to the Atlantic slave trade, was to actually have a committee begin to study that particular history. So that she set up this particular committee, and we were to make a set of recommendations. So the point I would want to make is that the Slavery and Justice Report, which has become this landmark document, was not from the bottom up. There was no mass student movement. There was no mass movement around faculty. There was no mass movement in the Providence community in Rhode Island that said Brown should begin to think about this. Rather, it was an African-American female president thinking about questions of reparations, thinking about free speech, and then trying to understand for herself, what is it that the university needs to do. Were we related? Did we have a relationship to the slave trade, or did we not have that relationship? When she set up that committee, there was no, I think it's important to know that there was no, the corporation did not give her a flack. That internally there was no flack from the students, and there was no real flack from faculty. There were some faculty who thought this is a lot of nonsense, but they kept quiet. Or talked about this in the corridors. The biggest pushback that she got was from outside of the university, from the Foxes, from the CNNs, from the NBCs, from the New York Times, from the Wall Street Journal. And the general argument was that this was an African-American president who was going to use this occasion to disgorge Brown's billions in his endowment to the Black community. And there are a whole host of letters, and when you read them, that's what basically they're saying. What is it that you are doing? We have allowed this African-American woman to come and take over this prestigious university. Now she's going to take the money and just give it to the Black community. The way Dr. Simmons set up the committee, I think, is important. It was democratic, but not really fully democratic. It was democratic in that it had faculty like myself, students, undergraduate, graduate students, staff, administrative staff. It did not have staff who were not in administration. So therefore, it did not have people in the cooking facilities. It did not have people who work in residences, people who worked on the lawns. I mean, they did not have those, what I like to call the union people who were on campus. It had a certain level of democracy, but not in my view, did not go far enough. The committee met for 3 years. We debated many things. We had research groups. We had programming. We had people writing theses. We had people, we had different classes and so on. And we had discussion. There were great, serious discussions around business of reparations and what it might look like. One of the things that I think that is important about the committee is that the committee strove, and we can talk about this if people want, strove to be consensual. In other words, that we move from the position internally. What the very early days of the report, some of us said, we're not going to be able to agree. So I think we're going to have a minority and a majority report. There's an incident episode in which we changed that, which we can talk about if you want. But we then decided after that particular episode that we would try and have a consensual report rather than a majority and a minority report. What were the findings of the report? Very briefly, the findings were that Brown did have connections to the slave trade, and it was in plain sight. We have something called the John Carter Brown Library, which is one of the extraordinary repository of archives for the colonial period and the slave period in the entire Americas. And if all you had to do was to go into that library and you would see the actual material of ships and so on for the Brown family and for others, people who sat on the corporation at the founding of the university and the various slave voyages that they were involved in. So it was clear that Brown had connections to the slave trade. What is also clear is that Brown did not have slaves who built the university. That what you had were people. There were 2 slaves who we found who were employed by members, by people outside, people who had slaves in the North, and who were then employed as their contribution to the building of the administrative building at Brown, what we call University Hall. So that this wasn't a situation where Brown or members of Brown itself had, or Brown University itself sold slaves, but there were members of the university who were involved in slave trade. And secondly, there were members of the corporation who were affiliated to the university who had slaves and who rented them out to help as their contribution, in their words, their contribution to the building of the university. The other thing I think is that the report made a set of recommendations, which I think are important to look at. One was the creation of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Then the other one was to maintain ethical standards in regard to investment and gifts. And this is very important because we had a long debate and argument and struggle in the committee around this. Where does Brown, where does the endowment come from? Where does the university invest this money and so on? Then the other part of the report or other recommendation was expanded opportunities at Brown for those disadvantaged by the legacies of slavery and the slave trade, and also to use the resources of the university to help ensure quality education in Rhode Island, not in the public schools. And that particular recommendation is really important because those of you, if you know anything about Rhode Island, would know that it is at the very, that everybody in education agree that it is at the bottom. The public school in Rhode Island is simply in a real mess. What is it that was left out? My second point. What was left out, I think, of the report is important. The first thing that was left out of the report was that we did not pay attention to the fact of the indigenous population in Rhode Island. Brown sits on Narragansett and Wampanoag land. And there's no mention of that, and therefore the question of the first historical dispossession of settler colonialism in the New England region was given very little attention. And this is really very important because we were focusing on slavery, but if you look at the actual slave laws in the New England area, particularly in, say, in Massachusetts, you will see that the very first slave laws were made against the Pequot, who were part of the indigenous population, who were defeated in the 1640s by the English settlers. And so therefore we didn't pay attention to settler colonialism. The other lacuna, in my view, was that we did not pay attention to the questions of capitalism. And we didn't do that. Some of us were very clear that this racial slavery is part of capitalism. Settler colonialism is part of capitalism and so on. But I think the drive to have a consensual report and to just focus on the questions of racial slavery meant that these two things were missing from the report. So as landmark and, very good as people, people are proud of the report and so on, some of us are beginning to argue that that the report did some work, but that it stopped short of some of the work that it actually needed to do. We're not saying that a report can do everything. What we're saying that you can't stop at the report, that you have to move beyond what some of the things that the report have said at the time and then try and do something else, particularly to make sure that the lacunas in the report are actually corrected. And part of the things that we are doing at the center is to make that move, so that we are involved in a particular project now, which in fact tries to think about the questions of the indigenous population and the African-American slavery, and the relationship between dispossession and racial slavery and the making of New England. And that's actually the center's major project. All right, let me move to the third thing, which is to think about the way in which questions of reparative justice, and just to say a few words on that. Firstly, that I think that one of the things that we did at Brown that other folks need, if folks are trying to do this, they need to think about, is to really think about this question of community. Where is it that you are located? For us at Brown, I think I've said that this report was a top-down business. What we now need to do is to think about what's the relationship between the community and the university, and to think about it in much deeper ways. I think this is important because that's when the questions of reparative justice emerges. It emerges when one thinks about not just the student community, not just the university community, but the relationship of the community, of the university to the community in which it lives. So for us, for example, it is important to understand that the center that I'm involved in talks about a center that is always in the world. In the world, because we think that these questions about slavery and colonialism and so on are not simply academic ones, but really about critical ones in for American life. So when we think about reparative justice, what is it that we are thinking about? I think for us, what we're thinking about is the following. And this is the argument that we are developing and putting forward to the university. Firstly, what is it that a university is supposed to do? A university is supposed to produce knowledge. That's what it's supposed to do. We also know it does other things. It reproduces an elite, particularly an elite university. It does that, but it is supposed to reproduce knowledge. How is it that we are there? What knowledge, therefore, is a university going to be producing? So that's one of the first thing is to look at institutions and say, what knowledge that you're reproducing? And therefore to also think about questions of reparative justice as also what some people have called cognitive justice. Secondly, we want to think about who attends the university. That really is very, very, very important. For us at Brown, we have a public school system, but there is no way people think about coming to Brown. I see Marsha smiling. The kids from the Hope High School and from the other high school walk through Brown, make a lot of noise to show that they're walking through there, or they walk around it to catch the bus on a particular street. But they don't look at Brown as a college on a hill. They don't look at Brown as this is a place that they can come. And we are actually studying the statistics of how many kids Brown has admitted from the Providence public school system in the last quarter century. To be able to say, if you're thinking about reparative justice, what do you need to do? What are the so-called, use a language that people use in admissions when we talk to them? What is the pipeline that you want to set up? And how do you set up these things? And then, as I said, the third thing is, what is the kind of curriculum that you are talking about? And how do you transform the curriculum? And obviously, what is it that the faculty looks like? Right? The kind of compositional diversity. And for me, the question of compositional diversity is really important. But what is also super important, I would want to argue, is what is it that people teach? Because you can have some people teaching all sorts of things that really doesn't really transform or change anything. And then for us, it is also about thinking about the Africana Studies program. And how can you develop an Africana Studies program that does some of the things that we think needs to happen. There are other very important things, for example, which like the question of policing and public safety on campus, and also the question of investment of the endowment. And here and that is a really critical question, because when you do that, you're touching all sorts of buttons on Brown and the corporation for which you will get pushback. I would just end by saying that it would seem to me that one of the things that one has to think about is that at each particular moment, if one thinks that way, that various struggles open up and creates various openings. That the CSSJ came out of a particular moment in which we were able to create a certain kind of center, but that there are other kind of centers that need to be found that needs to go further than us. That your processes, I understand it, will create a different kind of opening. And I hope that one is able to seize the times or to seize the moment of these openings and to really work to make these kind of institutions and the kind of work that we do sustainable, so that we are able to at least to create a different space on the university campus, if not to change it totally. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much for that, Professor Chatelain. We should be able to share now.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this invitation. And, we've been engaged in this work in some form, I guess, since 2015. And the context and the reference points for this work consistently shift. So when you mentioned, Adam, that it was been 6 years, you could have told me it was 6 million years because of the ways that these conversations about the university and I think a very strong and thoughtful movement to expose to a broader audience that the university is not always a space of neutrality, nor is it naturally a place of benevolence just because learning can happen there. And I think that over the past few years, some activism motivated by the actions of the Trump administration, but more broadly, I think that the scholarship around universities and slavery has been able to inspire deeper conversations about the university as an entity. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the process of the Georgetown Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation specifically, to really demonstrate that unfolding and that change in context and reference point for this type of work. And I think that the campaign that all of you have mounted at the University of Chicago is a sophisticated reflection of how to preempt the institutional responses that often come up when these questions are raised about responsibility, both past and present. All right, so like I do with my Zoom school twice a week, I'm going to share my screen now and I'll be presenting from slides, and then I hope we can jump into the conversation. So the Georgetown University Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation was convened in August of 2015. And I think that the moment that work emerged was animated by a number of forces. And it's interesting, as Professor Boakes talked about the moment in which Ruth Simmons stepped into this work, the moment that Georgetown took that step into the work was a little bit different, but Brown was often the reference point for how we understood the potential of this type of project. We met for 1 year. I wish we had 3. One very long and difficult year in order to complete a report at the end of the academic year, which was then released to the public the following fall. So we're talking about a span of about 13 months in which a group was impaneled, research was conducted, ideas were presented to the university, and then to the larger public in the next academic year. Some very basic frameworks for understanding Georgetown. Georgetown University is a Jesuit university. The Jesuits are a Catholic order known as the Society of Jesus that was founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuit order has committed itself to the education of people all over the world. And so Jesuit institutions can be found around the world and in the United States on either coast and in the Midwest. Jesuits arrived in the state of Maryland about, or what would become the state of Maryland rather, in 1634. And there's evidence of Jesuit slaveholding as early as 1717. Georgetown University was founded in 1789 by the Society of Jesus, and part of the charge of the university was that tuition not be charged. And so a lot of Catholic institutions depended on the wealth of patrons, as well as assets that were held in trust in order to keep their institutions free. And among those assets were plantations in Southern Maryland for the Jesuits at Georgetown University. And on those plantations, enslaved people toiled. And I think it's important to the point that was made about Brown. When we think about Georgetown and slaveholding, it runs the gamut of the ways enslaved people are at the center of the university's operations, not only on campus or accompanying students in order to serve them, not only as labor that is rented out as well as rented in the service of the university, but individuals who are toiling off-site in order to fund the university. And so we see all of these different kind of ways in which the system of slavery is enriching the university. Georgetown also was the site of the education of Southern Catholics who went to Washington, D.C. to be educated. And I think that if it was not 50-50, there may have been close to that in terms of Georgetown students who fought for the Confederacy as well as the Union. And that is why Georgetown University's colors are blue and gray. And so the university, again, is part of a narrative not only of slaveholding, of Catholic slaveholding, but also of the reunion period in the United States. A lot of the work that was done in this working group focused on the period between 1789 and 1862, and specifically on this period in 1838, in which 272 children, women, and men were sold from plantations in Southern Maryland to people in Louisiana. And this sale was highly controversial within the Jesuit community because of the presence of some European Jesuits who had taken a stance against slavery, as well as the Vatican that had advised the two leaders of Georgetown who were contemplating the sale to not get engaged in it. There were terms that were put on the sale, including respecting the sacraments of enslaved Catholic people. There were provisions about allowing groups of related people to remain together, but none of those conditions were actually followed, and all of the monies that were part of the sale weren't ultimately collected by the university. But this 1838 sale, the facts of the sale, in my opinion, became less important than the way that this sale started to encapsulate Georgetown's history of slavery. And this is one of the dangers, I think, in the ways that the narrative around the group then referred to as the 272 started to animate the discussion of Georgetown and slaveholding. Because of the poignancy of the story, because of the university's archival records of the sale, for many students and for people outside of the Georgetown community, 272 became the framework for understanding Georgetown and slavery. And so what you lose is the 18th century roots, or the 17th century roots of Jesuit slaveholding, as well as crusades to convert indigenous people. And you lose sight of the fact that after 1838, the university is still implicated in the system of slavery, formally for about 25 years, and then the period after emancipation in which Georgetown, as a community in Washington, D.C., is also engaged in the Jim Crow culture of Washington, D.C. And so I say this because any campaign that is about holding institutions accountable will have some type of anchoring figure or historical event to enter the narrative. It's really, really hard to broaden the narrative when you use that approach. And I think that there's a lot of arguments for and against it. But I think one of the dangers that came out of the process is in which 272 was supposed to explain a lot, and it barely scratched the surface of the enormity of Georgetown and slavery. So the charge came from President Jack DeGioia in 2015. And I think, part of what started this process was some campus buildings that were named after the two Jesuit leaders who presided over the sale, Fathers McSherry and Milady. Those names weren't necessarily well circulated on campus, but the reopening of residence halls that were named for them opened up a series of inquiries by a student in the student newspaper and a few people who were aware of this history and had questions about whether it was appropriate to remain on the names of these buildings. So the working group convened in the fall of 2015, and the president's office asked for recommendations on how to best acknowledge the university's relationship to the institution of slavery examine and interpret the appropriateness of Milady and McSherry halls, and convene events to share the history and initiate dialogue about the history. So at this point, from my perspective, this is just an institutional exercise. There's some history, there's perhaps the controversial act of discussing the names of buildings, but I think on the scale of 1 to 10, this is about a 2 in terms of deep engagement. And although you may have cranky alums writing in, nothing kind of rises to the level of, daring examination of history. And so as this work proceeded, there were a few things that I think were important contextually. One, we were only a few months away from the tragedy in Charleston, South Carolina at the Mother Emanuel AME Church. And I think that, a young white man who had been allegedly radicalized on the internet in white supremacist thinking, who kills a group of African Americans while at prayer, I think it really inspired a lot of reflective thinking in the context of a Catholic school. The movement for Black Lives that had, captured a lot of our attention, particularly in the fall of 2014 and the spring of 2015, and the way our students had really been mobilized by the movement, I think also impacted the decision to engage in this work. All sorts of campus protests that fall would accelerate the work of the working group, including the protests at the University of Missouri, protests around Title IX policy, the question at Yale over Calhoun College, and the various kind of symbols of the slaveholding past at major universities. And then I think in the context of a Catholic institution, Pope Francis's visit to Washington, D.C., I think had a huge impact on our work in the sense that it provided a framework to talk to a segment of the stakeholders of the university who are Catholic about the questions of social justice. And I think that this is important because every institution kind of has the what's the word I'm trying to say, the barometer or the gauge of how one engages. At the University of Chicago, it may be this whole thing about free speech. Don't let me go down that rabbit hole. But whatever that context is in that common language, we really wanted to take advantage of it in order to get parties to understand the importance of this work. And so when Pope Francis visited in the fall of 2015, he goes to the Obama White House. He's greeted by a Black Catholic gospel choir from St. Augustine's, the kind of mother church of Black Catholics. And the Pope talks about MLK talking about the insufficient funds, right? The bounce check. This is what every engagement about the working group on slavery, I started there. So that the kind of, resistance to the work. And I said, well, the Pope did actually talk about this in this way. So whatever it took to kind of capture the imagination of people who were questioning or critical or even curious about the work, I think helped. So the frameworks that were part of this process. So midway into our deliberation about the residence halls, we had decided that we were going to change the names, but a group of students activated a sit-in around the issue. So the buildings were given a temporary name, Freedom and Remembrance Hall, which I thought was an interesting strategy to just kind of temporarily put a name on a building and invite the community to submit potential names. There was a committee that had been organized to ensure that the university archives were very clear about where one can get information about Jesuit slaveholding. There was a committee that formed around ethics and reconciliation that was looking at what are the ways that in our present day context that we can also be reflective and active about issues of inequality. There was a local history committee to ensure that we were connecting to the many groups of Black DC genealogy groups and history groups that were very much interested in this. And we had a committee that formed to think about how we would memorialize the history on campus. And then there was an outreach committee to ensure that we were convening conversations with all interested parties. And one of the things that we made sure to do is to schedule events at every kind of possible conceivable hour so that people who worked on campus, staff folks, union folks, they could come during lunchtime. We would provide food and that people could have an opportunity to engage with the history. So the work proceeded. We all went home for summer break in April of 2016. And the week after we concluded our work, the New York Times journalist, her name is escaping me, I'm gonna remember in a second, published the first story of a series of stories, and which will contribute to her forthcoming book, about a group broadly known as the Descendants. And those are the people who trace their family lines to the 272. And this is where things got very interesting, because we learned shortly after this story came out that the university was actually engaged with a group of people who broadly defined themselves as descendants while the working group was convening, and they just didn't tell us. And so this put us in quite the position, because the entire report had been written from the perspective of people who either worked, attended, or had attended the university. And there was no input on people who identified as descendants. And so when the report was actually made available to the public and the press in September of 2016, members of the descendant community came to campus to express their displeasure and the umbrage that they took with the whole process. And that happens, right? I think that this is one of the consequences of these institutionally led projects, that you will only know the information that you are allowed to know. I found that incredibly disappointing, but not surprising when we think about what institutions try to keep close to the chest during this process. So the report, which was made available in September of 2016, the emergence of organizations that represent the interests of this descendants kind of came together in 2016. So an institutional research project now became a conversation about reparations on the terms of people who are most invested in that question. And so the next year, in April of 2017, Timothy Kaczynski, the head of the Jesuits of North America, issued a formal apology for the 1838 sale. There were a series of ceremonies that engaged the descendant community. And then there were a series of conversations about what a reparation structure would look like with the university and the descendants. At this point in the process, everyone who had been convened for the working group on slavery had made the conscious choice not to continue the work because there was a strong belief that the work was to be for 1 year for this report, and that the university had decided that the questions of reparations would be theirs and theirs alone. And so a lot of people mindfully stepped back from the work and kind of watched the university try to negotiate these dynamics themselves. But the students are quick. And so 2 years later, in April 2019, a group of students through a student government referendum passed a proposal for a reconciliation fund in which each student would pay a student fee of $27.20 per semester to go into a fund that would directly benefit descendants of the 1838 sale. And here we see that number 272 appearing again in the public as kind of encapsulating the history of Georgetown and slavery. The student referendum actually passed. It was excellent organizing. I was very proud of the students for doing it. And the university's board of trustees did not vote to approve the student fee. And instead, they decided that they were going to create their own kind of charitable fund that was the equivalent of the revenue that would have been raised by the student fee. And it was about $400,000 a year. And in October of 2019, this appeared in the New York Times with the question, is Georgetown's $400,000 a year plan to aid slave descendants enough? So what had been seen as a good faith effort on a part of a group of students from a privileged school in raising $400,000 became a number that was a subject of scrutiny in light of an institutional with larger financial resources. The last part of this story, which I didn't have a slide for, but a few weeks ago, the university announced that the Jesuits of North America had committed $100 million to reparation-like activities with agreement of a descendant group that doesn't represent all descendants, but some descendants, for racial justice projects and opportunities yet to be defined. I don't think that the students are done with this fight, but I think that the evolution of this initiative over the course of 6 years really does show you the way that external factors can sometimes drive the work, but then there are these unexpected parts of the work that add more complexity or more nuance or more challenges depending on the way that you look at it. And that is it for me.
Great. Thank you both so much. And I just want to invite folks in the audience to submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So I want to just maybe start with a couple of questions of my own before turning it to audience questions. And the first one I'd like to ask is, maybe a more the positive side of the projects both of your institutions took on. I think one hope for us among many is that by rethinking the history of the university and uncovering these kind of relations, the ways in which the university is implicated in reproducing racial and economic hierarchies, that this kind of repositioning of the university's history will have implications for how we teach, what we teach, for the ways we relate to the South Side going forward. So I wanted to ask what do you think was the most important kind of contribution of these projects and reports you were engaged in to the to the conversation on campus, either around university community relations or diversity and equity work? What do you think the kind of work you did or the work you and your colleagues did, how did it shift some set of conversations on campus? Oh, you're muted.
That professor is a complex question to answer from the Brown side, because I would argue that the Brown effort was managed so well institutionally that it became a model for other institutions. So, it opened the space for a Georgetown or for a Harvard, for a Princeton, for other people to say, if they have done this, and I'm being very brutal here, if they have done this and their alums and donors didn't run the other way, then perhaps we can do it, because that was one of the silent difficult questions. Does that, if you do this, a lot of the letters that came that I've looked at were, what you're going to do is chase away your donor base. So that there was a way in which I think the Brown opened up that institutional space. But in terms of trying to do, they will think about what it is that we teach. What's the relationship to the community? All those questions, except with how do we relate to the public education system in Providence and Rhode Island. All of that was really not focused, right, or was not dealt with in a serious way. So it was very much, if you ask me, it was really about the college on the hill, trying to reconcile and reckon with its history, which is fine. I'm not really, I'm not saying that it should not have done that. It is post that report that we are now trying to think about, okay, what is it that we teach? Or you have a center you have 2 centers on campus. You have, Africana studies and so on, who are now trying to push to say, okay, after this report and after you have acknowledged, what is it that you do? Other than, and this is what the students actually 2 weeks ago, in a meeting of the student government, raised the question of reparations, raised the question of, okay, after the report, what it is that you do. And so I think that's for us at Brown to answer that question is to say that because it was institutional, we did not think through some of the things about what do you do after, other than the kind of acknowledgement, and very important acknowledgement, that Brown was complicit in, through its, the early donors in the Atlantic slave trade. And that's how I see. So the work, so let me put it this way. We did a memorial on campus about a couple of years ago. And the argument that someone was made is that the memorial is about what the work that we need to do. It is not about a certain kind of commemoration. It's trying to think about what more work needs to be done on campus. And that work, quite frankly, means trying to think about the questions of the Browns' relationship to the community.
I would say that it brought new folks to the table in terms of, like it inspired a spate of programming that put the university as a subject of scrutiny. And I think it ushered in a kind of intellectual energy that was missing, that I think was good for the broader community. It also provided a way for folks, because they were doing genealogical research or local history, to see the university as a resource for their own kind of learning and their own, kind of self-understanding, which is, I think, sometimes really hard for a university to provide people who are not immediate affiliates of it. And I also think that it opened up a space among Catholic institutions, particularly, to take seriously the Catholic Church's place in white supremacist violence, in the history of slavery, in a way that made it possible and kind of legible, and allowed other places to do it and that wouldn't have been able to do it before. But I think that, I think the best part of this work is helping, as I said earlier, people reimagine the university as an institution that can be held accountable, instead of one that has to be forgiven because they provide jobs or forgiven because they gave some kids scholarships, right? Like, I think that there was a relentlessness in the pursuit of the university to be accountable that was really, really necessary.
Okay, one more from me, which is, I think both of the processes both of you have described in some ways have been really institution-led, with presidents, et cetera, who kind of inaugurated the commissions. And of course, the buy-in of the institution is really important. It provides a set of resources, it provides a set of a legitimacy to the project. It means that the findings, et cetera, are taken up in a way that it may not be if it hadn't had that initial backing. But I wondered how, but that kind of a top down is the way Professor Bogues described it, also comes with a set of limitations, right? A way that it constrains the project, it limits the scope and kinds of directions. So I want to ask you both, if you had been in charge of kind of putting together the charge of your various committees, or had the capacity to constitute the body, the groups of people who would be part of your commissions, how would you think about what questions would you have put front and center? Who would you have liked to have your as part of your kind of committees?
Marsha, please.
I mean, all I can say is that, this is, gosh, I was disappointed. I'm going to use the language Ruth Simmons taught us to use in a mentoring session when I was a graduate student at Brown. She said, always say that you're shocked and disappointed. And so I was both shocked and disappointed by the way that the institutional representatives for this process, especially when people started to talk about reparations and started to talk about money, how woefully unaware they were, not only about the history of slavery, but about the racial dynamics that the people who were making these demands, like the world in which they inhabited. And I found this really troubling, both in big and small ways. I think that there was a deep desire to support scholarly work that made the work seem fixated or fixed in a particular time, right? So I think for people who did the 19th century history on Georgetown and slavery, that was great. You were talking about a long time ago. But I found that there was just a real discomfort, I don't know how else to describe it, with sitting in rooms with Black people from all over the country who were saying, this institution owned my people. This warrants a conversation. This warrants a gesture. This warrants deep work. And so I think that, if I were part of the process, I think I would, take a step back and saying, like, who are we meeting? Who are we engaging with? What are the contexts? One of the things that I found really dangerous about this work, and I feel this very strongly, is that when we talk about reparations in terms of institutional access, I think it suggests to people that the tragedy of slavery is that more people didn't get to go to colleges. Like, there's this really uncomfortable way that when you talk about what a university debt is, the debt is always confined to what happens on a campus, as if the capital that flows in and out of universities isn't global. It isn't invested in every industry. It isn't extracted, wealth isn't extracted from everywhere. And so I think that I wish I could have said, like, believing that access to this university is justice makes fools out of everyone involved in this process. And to really, really focus on what were those historical choices and what are the current choices that continue to starve and alienate and hurt communities. And why don't we start from that place instead of suggesting that, a scholarship, a tuition, benefit would actually be anything close to a gesture of integrity. I think that's the place where I find myself very uncomfortable with a lot of the ways we frame, what repair can look like.
Yeah, I would echo some of what Marsha said, but I would also just add that I think, I actually don't like to think in the ways you just suggested, but if you ask me to say, one of the things that we should have been doing is that I think we should have moved off campus and begin to think about how to engage the people in the Rhode Island and Providence community. And I think not doing that meant that we were not able to hear the voices of how the historical structures operate today and how it impacts upon lives. So that there were colleagues who were sociologists or political scientists or whomever who could talk about the data as to where, how these things impact on people's lives in terms of redlining, in terms of job discrimination, etc., racial wealth gap, etc., all of those things. And we had all of those kind of discussions, but we never once thought about, okay, let's hear what the community has to say about some of the things that we are talking about and what insights could they give us that was important.
I mean, I think this has been a really important part of how we are thinking about our process here, and both having community representatives on the commission itself and about how we might really do this work of engagement. So thank you for that. I want to turn to now some questions from the audience. And First, we have a question from Lashea, which she says is both pragmatic and processual. She asks, in your respective efforts, how did you and colleagues document and archive your own process? And how did you account for hiccups, non-consensus, and changes in and outside of the institution that might have had an impact?
I mean, I think for the steering committee, we have a whole, we have an archive of all the notes of our meetings, etc. And that we actually in the process of putting those things online, including all the letters, that cursed us and so on, so that people can see, they get a full, people can have a full account of the process. The committee that that Dr. Simon set up, I had people who profoundly disagreed. There were some folks who thought that this was actually a lot of nonsense. In fact, we spent a couple of committee meetings trying to persuade people that this was not a nonsense, that it was important to do it, which is why we thought that we would reach that, why we thought we would not be able to do a report, that we would have a majority report and we would have a minority report. And there were people on the committee who felt that we shouldn't be talking about the historical Atlantic slavery, that we would focus very much on the way in which the university was spending its endowment, and the way it was treating treating staff on campus and so on. So there were all those things were currents that were in it. I think that once we decided that we would focus on the history of racial slavery, that we had to get that out. That because there were, part of what we were battling was the idea that somehow the North did not have slavery. We were battling an American myth that slavery was a Southern phenomenon, and that the North was pristine and was the land of white abolitionism. What the actual research work that we did showed us that was just simply not true. That the North was the actual commercial center, insurance center for slavery, from New York, Massachusetts, Providence, right up. And so that, and Connecticut with particular with stuff in the Caribbean, the British-speaking Caribbean. So that, or call it British-speaking colony. So that what you had, therefore, is that some of us decided that, okay, what's the historical American myth that we have to knock away? And how do we knock away that myth? To really talk about Northern complicity and to really make the point that America was a slave society. Once we decided that that was what we were trying to do, rather than getting into a long argument about capitalism and so on, which some of us really, which some of us held, and we thought that, okay, that then brought us together to say, okay, let's find a way in which we can make that historical point. And we had to do it internally as well, because the historical evidence led us there. In other words, the conventional archives, the SALI, the corporations, the ship's logs, all of the insurances, all those things were there for people to see. So the Doubting Thomases, you just had to show them, these things. So once we decided to actually narrow the focus is when we began to get the consensus. Now, I'm not saying that's the best process, but because I think that what that then did was that it really created a set of lacunas, particularly around the questions of the indigenous, that we now have to take account of.
The only thing I would add to that is I don't think we knew what we were doing. I think that we thought of this as just one of many committees that we serve on. We eat too many box lunches, we figure something out, we move on. But there were new challenges at every level. And I think that the one thing that I will say is that whoever is charged with kind of coordinating this work and leading this work is someone who has to be able to be good with students, because I feel like a lot of the directions of the committee was animated by student protest and student kind of pushback against the work, which I appreciated. but not everyone felt comfortable engaging with student activists, particularly the members of the committee who hadn't spent a lot of time around Black students. I mean, like, I think that a lot of this was Black students showing up for a kind of political process. And the engagement with those Black students, I think, required some very specific skills. And the other thing about process is that I think, clarity as to what the institution expects and what you expect from each other, having a sense of that and saying, like, if you want a research project, here's a research project, right? This is what we do as scholars. But if the university doesn't want this to be, fuel for a fire that they feel like they can't manage, then they have to also think about this too, right? So I think that there's this way where the work gets difficult when there's kind of different aims. And I think that moving forward after Brown and after Georgetown, institutions will take on this work in a very different tone, having seen the way that these explorations sometimes inspire a call for reparations or other types of scrutiny that the institution doesn't desire.
Okay, the following question is from Adrian Brown. Thanks for this talk. How did the process of producing reports rather than the contents deliverables alone change the work operations of your universities, if it did so at all? Because the work of making this, because this work is collaborative, did it seed other or long-standing collaborative efforts?
I'll jump in and say this. The one thing that I'm very proud of, it placed the history of slavery within the narrative of the institution for students and community members in ways that it never had before. And I think that is outstanding. I think the fact that it came from the top down incentivized a lot of engagement with the history, at varying levels of, some really rich, some really good, sometimes superficial. But I think that it changed the cultural norms and tones of how the institution talks about itself and what students expect to learn from the institution. And that is something that actually really surprised me. The staying power of, in order to really know this place, we have to know this element of its story. And there is I think that there's a deep desire for that I was really kind of surprised emerged after the working group convened and after some of the suggestions were accepted to provide resources for greater inquiry. And so I think that is definitely the success, that after several years, people still have, a great need that they feel like can be fulfilled within, different pockets of the university.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that I think that it has to be, once the report is completed and recommendations are laid on the table, accepted, and a plan is implemented, that one of the things that needs to happen is a constant renewal of these things, of this argument around slavery and the accountability of the university. Because if you don't do it, what happens is that students are here for 4 years, they undergraduates and graduates for a little longer. Is that they people then individuals don't kind of quite remember, and it only comes up to them when something has happened. So that there's a tendency of a kind of amnesia. In other words, we have done this, the recommendations are there, the plan is in place, it's been implemented, let's kind of move forward without actually trying to always going back to what it is that we are doing. Why is it that we did what we did? How does this make the university accountable? How does this history help us to understand America as well? All those kind of things you have to constantly do it. And so that, so that one of the things that I think we have done, we have decided to do is that every single year for the people who are coming to the university, they now have to read a report. Because what we found was that after 5, 6, 7, 8 years, that some people, you talk about a report and people kind of look at you as to what you're talking about. And so that we have to, university has to think very seriously about what kind of institutional means it is going to implement or put in place so that this work is always remembered and always becomes a touchstone for what the university is about, if it is serious.
Great. Okay, one more question from the audience. As this is UChicago administration has refused to acknowledge any connection to slavery despite findings from credible research. And this is pointing to work that graduate students in history did here, uncovering connections to Stephen Douglas and as plantation. Many of you might have seen this, but the university rejects this connection. Yet they want seemingly desperately to move forward with the process of truth and reconciliation. So how should we address this or how should we reconcile or address this contradiction?
I would just say what Dr. Simon says, quite frankly, which is that there is no way you're going to be able to think about, I don't think about reconciliation, but there's no way you're going to think about questions of repair and what it is that the university wants to do and how it wants to move forward without not confronting what your past is. It's like basic, right? And so that if the university does not want to recognize its relationship to the Atlantic slave trade and to slavery, I'll be very frank, I don't hold up much hope for questions of repair. It has to, in my view, recognize that because the question of slavery and indigenous dispossession are the two foundation stones of this republic. And if you don't begin from your relationship to those two foundation stones, and how they have shaped not just a past but a present, then what are you doing? I want to be as blunt as that. You can have a process and you can have people do all the things and you can go through the motions, but what are you doing if you don't start with confronting the historical truth that of how you were formed?
I find that a kind of strange position to take, but I guess the question that needs to be asked publicly is which history are you comfortable with? Which history of violence, which history of racism, which history of white supremacy? If you don't want to acknowledge this sliver, then as a collective, we can provide you an array of histories that you can determine which one you're most comfortable with. To kind of, I think, expose the absurdity of the framing, but also to say that, an important part of this conversation is that universities founded after 1865, universities in free states, universities that want to believe that they are outside of this, right? Like, this isn't an option, rather this is an opportunity to be more discerning. And so I think it could make for a really actually powerful campaign element to say, which history does the University of Chicago want to stand by?
Great. I think one of the ways, we've been thinking about this too, is that this could be an opportunity to really think about the 20th century experience, the post-slavery and post-emancipation racial projects that have structured the university, the United States, and the relationship between them. So whether, there is, maybe a contestation to be had about this particular denial of a relationship to slavery, but it's not like the university is somehow then absolved of a relationship and a deep imbrication with racism in the late 19th and 20th century. So with that said, to close, I just would like to invite you to maybe you've already said some of this, but to tell us where you think this kind of work on universities and reparation, thinking about university histories, where it should go, where it might go. Brown and Georgetown have been really pioneering places in this regard. So what do you think is the future of this kind of work? And we'll close with that.
Please go ahead.
I'll just say this. I love the framing of No More Diversity. I love it. I think that there's a really wonderful way to say that the kind of bag of tricks that universities have to distract and to deflect, we are no longer accepting that as, business as usual. I think that there is, I think the deep poignancy of this past year is that we saw on college campuses, nearly the same demands of 1968 being made on institutions, right? And so if we are going to ask kind of questions about what the future can look like, we are not going to use the old strategies and old tactics. And I think that framing is good. I think that in terms of, the future of this work, I think that, your point about extending, extending the timeline, saying that if we are not grounding our demands in the 19th century, we're going to ground our demands on what happened in this community last week or yesterday, right? And we're going to help you see that we don't settle these questions with statements. We don't settle these questions with kind of initiatives. We settle these questions with kind of deep reflection. And that the thing that's most important when you work at a university is to remind a university kind of what it can do. Because I think that when we get into these conversations about reparations or any kind of restorative justice, they'll say, well, we don't control this. The city controls this, or we don't do this. But maybe, thinking about it, I said no more diversity, more than diversity. Taking a step back and say, well, what can we do? Right? Like, we're going to move from a position of all the things that are not our fault or not our business, then what do we have the ability to do? And start from a frame of what we can imagine is possible, instead of getting into that cycle of trying to reduce liability.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo everything that Marsha said, and just to say that the question is really part of what the topic is, which is how do you make universities accountable? And that accountability is not just to the members of the university community, but actually to the community in which they live, in which they exist. And that to me is really is a central question. And that means that you can either start from, you can think about historical slavery and so on, but you can also think about racial capitalism. You can think about what it is that the university, how does the university involve itself in a contemporary way in a set of projects that actually reproduce American society. So despite its talk about diversity, et cetera, it engages in a set of projects that reproduces society. And that to me is what the university needs to be accountable. If it wants to do something, it needs to be accountable for the actions it takes that reproduces those actions, reproduces the society in certain way.
Great. I think this is a really wonderful place to close us today. I want to thank Anthony Bogues and Marsha Chatelain for joining us this afternoon. Thanks to all of you for making time to be part of this conversation. A few weeks from today, the Academic Unit Committee of the More Than Diversity campaign will have its final conversation on critical university studies. So I hope those of you interested will join us then. And everyone have a great weekend. Thanks so much.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.